singing. Greetings, everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Glenn. First name, that'll do. And a lot of you have been trying to get to know over the weeks. Overcome my inhibitions and made friends with everyone here. Our topic today is about Jesus and him being the light of the world. And we're going to look at the Gospel of John particularly. So if you open your Bibles in the Gospel of John, and you can stay there. I'm not going to go anywhere else in the Bible. The Gospel of John is an amazing piece of literature. It is an inspired piece. Of course, inspired by God, and we want to get that picture today. In John chapter 8, verse 12, my first verse is where Jesus says, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." And walking in darkness is, not great, as we know. Darkness is a symbol of ignorance and not knowing where you're going. Jesus made great claims in his life, and he claimed to be the great I Am, which is the topic of this series. The self-existent one from eternity. He claimed to be a divine person. He claimed to be the Messiah, the deliverer of Israel. But it was really, really difficult for the children of Israel, for the Jews, to accept him as the Messiah, because the rabbis had taught them a different sort of Messiah, and they had taught them a Messiah that would be a conquering king, a glorious, king that would come and take David's throne. And that was a popular idea. And here was humble meek Jesus, the carpenter's son. Lowly person, poor occupation. How could he be the Messiah? And besides that, all the religious authorities did not accept him. Which of the priests, which of the Pharisees have accepted him? None. Why should we follow him? This was the thing of the day. But still, Jesus made these claims, and I want to share you a bit of the structure of the book of John. If you put the next one. The Gospel of John breaks into two halves, and there's the first 12 chapters, they call it the book of signs. Because in that book, in that first 12 chapters, Jesus is doing various signs, and it's his public ministry. The other half of the Gospel of John, it's about the death and resurrection of Jesus. He's not doing his public ministry anymore. It's done. So we want to look in the book of signs here. And in the book of signs begins in chapter 1 with a prologue. And it ends with an epilogue, which is chapter 12. And it's kind of symmetrical. And right in the middle, there is a set of teachings in chapters 6, 7, and 8. And in these chapters, Jesus feeds 5,000. He walks on the water. He says, "I am the bread of life." I'm stealing someone else's thunder. He says, "If you eat this bread, you will never hunger again." And in chapter 7, he says, you need to drink the water of life, and you'll never thirst again. And also in chapter 8, he says, I am the light of the world. And also at the last verse in chapter 8, he says, before Abraham was, I am. That's the last verse of that chapter. So there's another I am. He's saying, I am the self-existent one. I am, before Abraham, I am. So that gives you an idea of what's going on in the book of John for these chapters. Yeah, that's up there. Good. So, in the Gospel of John, in this book of signs, in those middle chapters, in chapters 6, 7 and 8, Jesus is doing miracles, he's doing signs. He's giving evidence to them that he is the Messiah. That's what it's all about. He's telling them, I am the great I am, right? The bread of life, the light of life. Before Abraham, I am. All that's happening in those chapters. 6, 7 and 8. So the Jews are being tested. Are you going to accept Jesus as the Messiah? Or are they going to reject him? He healed the people. He fed them physical bread, right? Did a miracle. And they wanted those things. They wanted the benefits. They wanted the earthly things. And they even, on that day after he fed them the 5,000, they came and tried to force him to be king. Take David's throne, That's in John chapter 6, verse 15. Take David's throne. Be a worldly king. This is the sort of Messiah they wanted. And instead, through these chapters, Jesus puts an emphasis on the spiritual. He says, here's the spiritual bread, the living water of the Holy Spirit, the spiritual light. He emphasized those things. Jesus is like, I can change your spiritual life. That was his emphasis. But the people were more interested in changing their physical lives, They were more interested in, being a powerful kingdom, and they weren't interested so much in their spiritual lives being changed. Actually, in John chapter 6, verse 66, from that time forward, many disciples rejected Jesus. Notice the number of the verse. I always remember it by that number. It's easy to remember, 666. And they all apostatized, because they didn't like this sort of Messiah. So yeah, that's an interesting verse. They all left Jesus, and even at the end of chapter 6, you see the 12 disciples, even they're a bit shaky, Disappointed with Jesus, you're not the kind of Messiah we want. And Jesus says to them, will you leave me also? To the 12. And so the opposition to Jesus only increases in chapters 7 and 8. They don't want that Messiah. They don't want this spiritual healing or this spiritual bread. So this is the central section of John. Now I want to talk about the two miracles that happen either side. In John chapter 5 and John chapter 9. This central section of John is bracketed by two miracles, right? So these are like brackets. Which you'll see, back to the other one, sorry, not that one yet. I want to talk about the Sabbath healing, take up your bed and walk. And the other one, the man born blind, the healing miracle in John chapter 9. These are two they surround the middle section. And these two miracles are actually related to each other because they're so similar. And you may have noticed the similarities between these two miracles. And so I want to talk now about these two miracles and the similarities and the parallels between them. Let's go to the next one then. You notice these miracles in John chapter 5 and John chapter 9, they are both the pool is involved, right? The pool of Siloam, the pool of Bethesda. And in both these miracles, the men have been sick for a very long time. You notice, one for 38 years and the other one for a lifetime. And yet, in both these miracles, Jesus takes the initiative of healing. He says, okay, these men are, they're hopeless, and he comes and he does the action. And he tells them, he commands them to do something, to be healed. Take up your bed and walk, or go and wash your eyes. And you'll notice both these miracles are performed on the Sabbath day, which is a big no-no for the Jews. A huge problem, right? They said, no, you shouldn't be doing this. Both miracles, they're very similar. And in each miracle, Jesus disappears. You notice he melts into the crowd. We don't know, we're not told where he goes. And when he does that, both men are challenged by the Pharisees. They come and cross-examine the men that are healed. Who healed you on the Sabbath? Who dared to do that? And in both cases, Jesus finds a man at the end of the story, and he again meets with them and challenges them to put their lives right, or to, do whatever. Also, both stories end in discussing the guilt of the Pharisees. In one story, they're trying to murder Jesus, and the other story, Jesus makes a statement about their guilt. So, two very similar stories, and these bracket the middle section of John, chapter 6, 7, and 8, which is very interesting. But what I found most interesting about these two stories is the differences. There's differences, right? And these kind of spoke to me. Is the next one about the differences? Yeah. Yeah, these are the differences. In the first story, the man suffers as a result of his own sin. Okay? Because Jesus says to him, sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. I don't think he was sinning when he was lying paralysed for 38 years. So he must have been sinning before for Jesus to caution him, don't do that again. So his disease must have been a result of his paralysed condition somehow of his sin. I don't know how, we're not told. The second man, he does not suffer as a result of his sin, because he's a blind man, and Jesus says in John chapter 9 verse 3, neither this man sinned nor his parents. He didn't sin. So you see in these stories there's a contrasting reason for suffering. One man has done something, and the other man, he's suffering, he didn't sin. But Jesus heals them both. And the other difference I found was the story of the blind man. His response is greater than the paralysed man. I'm sure the paralysed man was really grateful that Jesus healed him. Paralysed 38 years, obviously. And when Jesus comes to challenge him, he says, go and sin no more, And the man tells the Pharisees it was Jesus that healed him. And then he departs, but no more is said, right? So we don't really hear much of a great response. But the second man, there is recorded a greater response. I really like this. Jesus challenges him. He challenges the Pharisees, I was going to say. I want to talk about that a bit more. And he aligns himself with Jesus. And he's thrown out of the synagogue, right? Cast out by the Pharisees. Also, not only does he receive physical sight, he receives spiritual sight. So these are the points. He worships Jesus, also as the Son of Man. So I believe, or at least recorded, is a greater response to Jesus. He's worshipping him. He's taking his side. He's telling the Pharisees, no, I'm with Jesus, go away. So, at least it's a greater response. But So with these two stories that bracket that middle section, I want to talk about a deeper lesson of these two related miracles. Do you know what the deeper lesson is? Because in the Bible, physical disease is compared to spiritual disease, okay? And like the first man, spiritual paralysis comes because of sin, right? You've sinned. And you become like paralyzed. And like the man, you know, we're paralyzed and we think the solution is to wash ourselves. You know, get to the pool and wash yourself. To clean ourselves by our own effort, right? Trying to get there. And if we could only get to that pool and wash, yeah, it's like a bad dream. You know, you've had a bad dream where you're trying to get there and you can't move in your sleep. And always trying and never able. This man represents those who are spiritually impotent. Why are they impotent? Because they're too damaged by sin to recover by themselves. And a lot of us are like that. Well, even I felt that in my life. I can't get there. I can't do it. You know, I try and fail. This is where the intervention of Jesus really helps you, right? So a lot of us are like that first man. In the other case, physical blindness, it represents spiritual blindness. It doesn't come necessarily as a result of sin. It comes, I often believe, from never having the opportunity to know. If you've never had the opportunity to know. And these people can't recover themselves because of ignorance. They don't know about Jesus. They don't know anything. They're spiritually blind because of lack of opportunity. And when Jesus intervenes to save them, their spiritual sight often exceeds that of others, right? They get the picture. You know? So in the Bible there is two types. And I believe these stories are showing us that Jesus has power to heal people who are in ignorance and people who are in sin. But also I thought, what was interesting about those stories is another thing. The Pharisees, they were against those healings in both cases. They considered themselves to be the, God's representatives on earth, holy men, But Jesus' work didn't fit. So they were against him. And this is rather sad. They would rather keep the people in ignorance and sin, keep the Bible away from them, Stay in ignorance and darkness. Keep the people in darkness so we can control them, we can dominate them. What kind of religious people are they? So do you see what I'm saying in a spiritual sense? People sometimes will never be healed of sin. Sometimes they'll never come out of ignorance because of the religious leaders. Isn't that disgusting? But that's what's happened in the world all the time. They want to keep us in darkness and keep the Bible away from us, right? But we got the Bible. We got the light. So, and I know in ages past you weren't even allowed to have it. The church banned it, right? So today we have it. So I want to talk more about the blind man because that really struck me. I'm going to explain more of John chapter 9, which is really interesting. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, John chapter 9. I really like the structure of John chapter 9. It's very interesting. You see in John chapter 9, from verses 8 down to verse 34, there's a debate, right? I'll talk about that after. There's a debate going upon. The Pharisees are debating with the blind man and his family and that. But this central debate is bracketed again there is a fort at the start and a corresponding fort at the end of the chapter. For example, you see here, Jesus here in verses 6 and 7, for example, that he has the blind man and he heals him. He gives him physical sight, right? And then, at the end, verses 35 and to 38, he gives the man spiritual sight. You know, his eyes are open in regard to Jesus. He says, "Oh, you're the Messiah," you know. He finds Jesus. So, on the first fort in the chapter, it's physical sight. Is it second fort? Is spiritual sight. I don't know if you see that. Okay. Also, bracketing that middle section is another one. I think it says B. Jesus is what? The light of the world. And that's in John chapter 9, verse 5. So that actually appears twice in the Bible. That appears in chapter 8 and also appears in chapter 9, where Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." So here's the big emphasis. And that matches with here in that one down, verse 39, which is an interesting thing. It says, "Where Jesus has come into the world, he is to give either sight or blindness." You know, light can either give sight or blindness, when you think about it. When you're groping around in the dark, you want light, right? And it can give you sight. You can get a torch, have sight. But when you're driving on the road and you have bright lights and there's a kangaroo, the light can blind the animal and you can hit it. Light can give blindness. And you see that sometimes when people are groping in darkness and you give them spiritual light, it's too much for them, right? It's like, "Oh no," you can upset someone. And we'll actually see Jesus actually doing that. And then finally, in the last, the relationship between blindness and sin, A is corrected, right, that one. So Jesus corrects the understanding of the disciples in the beginning, and in the end of the chapter, he corrects the understanding of the Pharisees. So it all fits like that. So in the beginning, the disciples asked a question about the blind man. They say to Jesus, was this man born blind because of his parents' sin or his sin? And Jesus says, "No, neither. Neither." And in the last part of the chapter, in verse 40 and 41, the Pharisees ask Jesus and they say, "Are we blind?" And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, "Yes, because you claim to have spiritual sight, and yet you do not. You are blind. And therefore your sin remains." That's in John chapter 9, verse 41. So you see, we start with physical blindness, not because of sin, and we end the chapter with spiritual blindness. Yes, that is because of sin. It's a really interesting structure that John chapter 9 has. Now I want to talk all about the middle part of John chapter 9, the debate between the groups of people there. So come over to John chapter 9. Let's have a look at some of these people. There's 4 groups of people I want to talk about and how they respond to the light. There are the neighbours in verse 8. There is the blind man himself. There are the parents of the blind man in verse 20 about. And there is also the Pharisees. Okay. Let us talk about verse 8. Here the neighbours, when you live next to someone, you expect, you should know your neighbours, right? But these neighbours are not particularly engaged in the healing. They're not ready to acknowledge this miracle. They thought, the healed man might be someone else. Here in the verse 8, they say, These are the neighbours. Is not this he that sat and begged? You know, isn't it him? Oh, some said, yeah, this is he. But others said, no, he is like him. This is not him. He's like him, but not him. See, so they thought the healed man might be someone else. It's like they don't even know their neighbour. Like, are you some other person? So, the neighbours, they don't even have any recognition. They're not like, wow, you've been healed, you know, you're the blind man, you're our neighbour, oh, that's so cool, you know. There's nothing like that. They're like, oh, is it really you? Their response is doubtful. A poor response. So they're indifferent. They don't really care. It's like, oh, are you really? You're healed? They're indifferent to the light. They brought the man to the Pharisees, and verse 16 says there was division among the Pharisees. So there are two schools of thought with the Pharisees. Some of the Pharisees say, this man is not of God, he is a sinner. While others of the Pharisees say, how can a man do such miracles who is a sinner? So at this point, the Pharisees have a tiny bit of light. Maybe the miracle has something in it, right? They're almost like, yeah, maybe. And while other ones say, no, he breaks the Sabbath, he's a sinner. Some of them say, how can a sinner do such signs? We're not sure, so let's interrogate the man. And the healed man in verse 17, he says, the blind man says, Jesus is a prophet. He believed. Well, he healed him. But because of their unbelief, the Pharisees summon the parents, bring the parents in. They're looking for a way to escape. They're looking for a way to confirm their unbelief. They don't want to believe. They don't want the light. They want to believe. They don't want to believe it happens. So they ask the parents here in about verse 20, or verse 19, is it? Yeah, they say, was he really born blind? Maybe you know, was it really? How does he see now? So the parents are under pressure. You know, if they acknowledge the miracle of Jesus, they risk being thrown out of the synagogue. So they say, yes, he's our son, but we don't know how his eyes were opened. Ask him. He's an adult. Nothing to do with us. We don't know what happened. He's their own son. We don't know what happened here. They don't want to acknowledge Jesus. In verse 22, it says, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone had confessed that Jesus was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. So they'll throw you out of the church if you believe in Jesus. You've been outcast from society, you know. So to acknowledge Jesus would be really disruptive to their lives. You know, they lived in that society. The whole of, you know, the fabric of their life would be, you know, in danger. Their place in society. So they weren't prepared for that. To acknowledge the light? No. So I see them as non-committal. These are non-committal people. So the neighbours, they were indifferent. No, we don't really care. But these ones were like, no, we don't want to commit. The Pharisees, still seeking to establish their unbelief, they summoned the man a second time. And now there was a change. You notice there's a change with the Pharisees. They've come to a better decision, you know. Well, not a better decision, a worse decision. To start with, they were a bit divided. Half of them were like, yeah, this could be of God. And the other half were like, no, he's a sinner. But now they become more unanimous. They realise the implications. What are the implications? If they acknowledge the miracle, they're going to have to change their views a lot. They're going to have to change their religion. They're going to have to, have their ideas about Jesus changed. Is he the Christ? And they're going to have to acknowledge their understanding of the Sabbath is wrong. They're going to have to change, and their religion is wrong, right? That's difficult. People don't like that. To acknowledge your religion is wrong, that would be really disruptive to their system of belief. So they were unanimous. They tell the man, here in verse 24, you're following on, it says, this man is a sinner, they said. They're trying to put it into the blind man's, brain. Repeat after us. He is a sinner. But the blind man is not having it. He's not having it. He responds. He says, I don't know if Jesus is a sinner or not, but I know he healed me. And then in verse 25, he says this, I already told you, why do you want to know about Jesus again? Why? Will you be his disciples too? This is way too much for the Pharisees, right? So, to be schooled by a beggar blind man, told some kind of, you don't tell us, we're the religion, we're the top. Get out. So, they make a choice. They shut out the light. They're not going to change. They take action against the man, out of the church. Throw him out. But the man responds with to the work of God. He acknowledges Jesus, and he says Jesus is of God, and he even worships him there as the Son of Man. In verse 35, you see that. But the Pharisees, they have the same thinking. In the beginning, the disciples thought the man was born in sin, right? Because he's blind. Now, notice what the Pharisees say to the man in verse 34. They say, thou wast altogether born in sins. Dost thou teach us? Do you teach us? We're the top. You're born in sin. That was the attitude of the disciples at the beginning, remember? So now they have the attitude, the Pharisees. And they cast him out of the synagogue and shut him out. Get out of the church. So I want to conclude with some thoughts now. Spiritually speaking, when we shine a bright light into a situation, it forces a choice. It forces us to choose. Like the rabbit in the headlights. Do you run or do you stay? It forces us to choose, okay? Because Jesus is a very bright light. Will we acknowledge the light? Will we acknowledge Christ as our Saviour? That is the question. The neighbours, they weren't so worried. The parents, no, non-committal. Knowing man, they knew the man all their lives, right? That was their child. They had every evidence the miracle had occurred. He's born blind. Yet, just knowing it. And then the religious authorities cowed them into a position of non-committal. How terrible. Oh, we won't commit. Ooh. And even, to start with, some of the Pharisees, they wanted to acknowledge the light. There was maybe there was a smidgen of good, But by the end of the chapter, they're in complete darkness. And then in verse 39 in the chapter which I showed you in the structure of the book, Jesus said this to them, for judgment I am come into this world, that they which see might not see, and they which see might be made blind. So the light brings judgment. Like I say, a bright light can blind you. The Pharisees claim to see, they claim to have some light, division among them, yeah, maybe that's a miracle, yeah, maybe a miracle of Jesus. But ultimately they went against it. And even having the evidence, having the miracle done before them there, a man blind 1 minute, and the evidence is there. So you sometimes wonder about human beings, right? All the evidence, all the evidence you want. And they deny it. That's human beings. We're crazy. So if there was no light, if there was no chance, if there was no knowledge, there would be no sin, right? No sin. But now, they had some light, they had a lot of light, they had responsibility. And they had the light, but they refused it. So their guilt was heavy, deep. I want to talk finally about our response to the light. We could be like the neighbours, indifferent. I don't care. Don't want to know. Indifferent. A lot of people are indifferent. Or the parents, like non-committal. I don't care. All the evidence is there, but I don't care. I won't commit. No. Don't want to change my life. No. Or like the Pharisees, I have my own religion. It doesn't fit. They're complacent. I don't want to, be different. Often when you go, appeal for missions, you knock on the door. Oh, we've got our own religion. Get out. There's people always say that, right? We've got our own religion. Doesn't fit. What is our response? I really like the response of the blind man. And I want to have that response in my own life. I hope you want to have. He was like, I don't care what people think of me. I don't care what they do to me. You can throw me out. I want to acknowledge the light. I don't care. I will follow it. It was more important for him to follow Jesus than anything else. He was willing to lose everything. And he openly aligned himself with Jesus. I think some of us have made commitments to follow Jesus already, but some of us have made no commitment. Don't do that forever. Don't be non-committal forever. Make a commitment. And those who have made a commitment already, make a greater commitment. Because we want Jesus to shine his light into our lives. We want the brightness. So we can see. You don't want to live in ignorance. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in darkness. You know what happened to the Pharisees afterwards? They went into greater darkness and greater darkness. And then the Romans came and destroyed them all. And they're all dead. And all their children are dead. We don't want to go into darkness. We want to have the light of life and to have a light for our path. And that's what it says in the Psalms, I used to memorise that verse. What does that verse say? Someone tell me. What? I heard it. Louder.
The word is a light unto my path.
Thank you. Thy word is a light unto my path and a lamp unto my feet. Thank you. That comes from the Psalms. And I can't even remember the reference. I'll read it after. But I want to close with those thoughts and encourage you all to follow the light. Commit your life. Don't be like those other people. The Pharisees and the parents. They need to follow. And the neighbours. Don't be indifferent. Don't be complacent. Don't be non-committal. And be daring. Don't care. Follow Jesus.